anger on the streets and a war of words between governments. How will Thursday's attack on security forces in Indian-administered Kashmir impact on the already tense relations between India and Pakistan? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. A full-blown crisis is looming between nuclear rivals India and Pakistan. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is promising a fitting response against an attack in Indian-administered Kashmir that killed 44 of its paramilitary forces. Islamabad has condemned the incident and has denied supporting the group thought to be behind it. Laura Burden-Manley has more.
Scenes of devastation. Body parts strewn across the Jammu-Srinagar highway in Indian-administered Kashmir. Dozens were killed when a car packed with explosives rammed into a truck that was part of a security convoy. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi observed a moment of silence to remember the victims before he gave a strong warning.
I want to tell the terrorist groups and their patrons that they have committed a huge mistake, and they will have to pay a big price for this.
It's the worst attack to hit the disputed Himalayan region in 3 decades. The Pakistan-based armed group Jaish-e-Mohammed says it's responsible for the attack. Although Islamabad denies any involvement, India has accused it of allowing armed groups to operate freely. Pakistan's foreign ministry issued a statement calling the attack a matter of grave concern, saying they've always condemned heightened acts of violence in the valley. India has taken diplomatic steps, including shutting down trade between the neighbouring nations. Kashmir has been divided between India and Pakistan since 1947. Both countries claim the area. Tens of thousands have been killed in the past 3 decades. This latest attack targeted a large military convoy. Investigators are still trying to piece together how the armed group was able to strike such a sensitive target.
What is the nature of explosion, how it has happened, what led to this explosion, these are all subject of investigation.
As India's National Investigation Agency begins its work, activists are on the streets of Indian-administered Kashmir, with many chanting anti-Pakistan slogans. And the government has shut down internet in some areas. The military has imposed a curfew in parts of Indian-administered Kashmir in an attempt to restore calm. For Inside Story, Laura Burden-Manley.
Let's bring in our guests for this edition of Inside Story. From New Delhi, Sriram Cholia, Professor and Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs. In London, Victoria Schofield, a historian who's written a book on the Kashmir conflict. And in Islamabad, Imtiaz Gul, head of the Centre for Research and Security Studies in the capital of Pakistan. Thanks, sir, for joining us here on Inside Story. Sriram Cholia, can I come to you first? Relations between India and Pakistan have never really normalised since independence and the subsequent partition of the subcontinent in 1947. In 2019, one can't really see this getting any better in the light of what's happened in the last, 36 hours?
That's right, Zoel. I think it's taken on a new dimension. If you could take the historical standpoint, in 1947, it was about territory, and then, it morphed into something else, kind of an independence struggle by some Kashmiri Muslims with the Pakistani support. And now, increasing in the last 2 decades or so or more, we are seeing that it's, the focal point is this jihadist violence and the Indian counterinsurgency against it. So the attack on our security personnel just confirms this shift. And as far as India is concerned, the central point for us, the point of contention is this violence against our civilians and our security forces. So it is being seen with a lot of outrage and as something that's totally beyond the pale and unacceptable. And just the scale of the attack and the number of deaths of our soldiers, there is a national consensus that we must do something about it. And I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi if he hates one phrase, it is soft state. And I think his entire career has been built upon having a robust national security portfolio in his governance. And now he's reaching the end of 5 years, his first term. I think he's increasingly going to move towards a multi-pronged response, including tactical surgical strikes by special operations forces, possible diplomatic isolation campaign on a global scale, economic punishment, and also lobbying the US to try and prevent Pakistan from getting the IMF bailout that they've been seeking for a long time, and also trying to squeeze the Pakistanis by making up with China, which is, of course, now the #1 benefactor and, in a way, an overlord of Pakistan through their investments and loans.
Okay,
so
Mr. Choliya, let me just interrupt there.
Mr. Choliya, let me just problem, and
Mr. Choliya, let me come in there.
And looking for a big.
Mr. Choliya, let me come in there. Let me just come in there. I think you've hit a lot of bases there that we need to discuss in depth throughout this whole programme. Let me bring in Victoria Schofield. You heard what our guest in New Delhi had to say, Victoria. You've actually written extensively on the whole Kashmir conflict for many years. Is this a seismic shift in policy from the militant armed groups? Is this about homegrown terrorism on Indian soil that's been exacerbated and encouraged from Pakistan? Is Pakistan to blame? Lots of questions here about this particular attack and how it's actually impacting both on New Delhi and Islamabad.
Well, I think there is a certain seismic shift in that signifies yet another nosedive between India and Pakistan. If you're looking at the two countries, there have been several nosedives over the last 30, 40 years, but this is another very significant one. In terms of what actually is at issue, the dispute over the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, I think, unfortunately, in the last several decades, people have lost sight of what that dispute was. And it's almost like they're hating each other for the sake of hating each other. And this is why I think it's absolutely essential for an element of restraint to be used, because actually India and Pakistan, Indians and Pakistanis don't hate each other, but somehow the rhetoric gets whipped up with the two domestic communities that you can almost see this deteriorating into a war situation if that element of restraint isn't used as a prelude to sitting down finally and saying, what are we actually fighting over in relation to Jammu and Kashmir, and we have to resolve it.
Let's bring in Imtiaz Gul here. You've heard what the first two speakers have said, and where Victoria talks about restraint is required from the politicians on both sides of the border. The blame game has already begun, really, as far as New Delhi is concerned, accusing Pakistan of supporting these Indian-based militant groups. Pakistan denies it, as it always does, through its foreign ministry. How long can Pakistan continue to take this sort of position when it's been firmly proved in the past that such operatives are based in Pakistan, do espouse very extremist views about India and how both its civilians and its military should be treated? Why have they not acted?
Well, I think in the first place, the person who carried out the attack is a native born in Pulwama, and he may have been attached to the Jaish-e-Mohammed, but the problem is exacerbated by this finger-pointing, instant finger-pointing within minutes of every attack, pointing to Pakistan and equating the act of a non-state actor to that of a state actor. So I think therein the problem lies. Pakistan has banned all these organizations. Pakistan has had its own problems, its own deaths, more than 350 suicide bombings, massive suicide bombings in the last 10 years, which have killed thousands of people. Pakistan never said that it's because of the terrorist infrastructure in India or the Indian support for the Afghan-based terrorists. Many of them are Pakistanis. So somehow the Indian leadership shall have to restrain itself from pointing fingers instantly at Pakistan and engage in dialogue. There are spoilers on both sides, and I think repeatedly we have dealt with those spoilers. So Pakistan, as far as I know, has been trying to wean these people away, pull the rug from under the feet of all these organizations, but it has a socio-political dimension, and that is what is a restraining factor for Pakistan as far as totally deneutralizing or neutralizing these organizations and their huge cadre. It's hundreds of thousands of people learning in their seminaries, following them. So Pakistan has limits to do the things that India wants.
Let me just come in there, because you talked about sort of state and non-state actors. I mean, it's the non-state actors such as Masood Azhar, who lives in Pakistan, who's admitted that it's his group and his influence that's had behind this attack. And so when somebody so vocally admits to, if you want to put it any simply, the crime, why can't the state prosecute this man, even though they've banned his group? He obviously has support, does he not, to be able to roam freely in Pakistan? Well,
I think there's a very heavy fence that separates Pakistani and Indian Kashmir. And I haven't heard any direct claim from Jaish-e-Mohammed's head or their central leaders that they carried out this attack. There's a statement by a young man, a native Indian origin Kashmiri. And I think now to equate that, yes, you are right. The organization exists here, but I think they are being barred from operating out of Pakistan. There are ideological synergies that are available, yes. And this has born out of the original sin. And the original sin was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the American response to that, for which all shades of religious organizations, entities were used by the Americans, by the West, and by Pakistan. And this is the spillover effect. And right now, what India is dealing with is the native, original wave of terrorism, militants that have grown with violence. And I think they don't want India to be around. So I think it has to be dealt with politically rather than pointing fingers at Pakistan every time a bomb goes off. OK, we can carry on with this debate even from New Delhi. And I know that Sriram was disagreeing with some of what you had to say in terms of, what we think of militant and terrorist groups. Let's just move this on, Sriram, to develop this conversation more. Pro-Pakistan, pro-independence armed groups have been banned by India, but seemingly operate and in a controlled way, perhaps, in the region of Indian-administered Kashmir. It is a very militarised area. I've been there myself. I've seen how the military are deployed. It must have a huge intelligence operation in that region. So what went wrong with the intel? If you have that much military personnel and you have the intel, how did they not know this was going to happen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, internal security, we need to do a lot better, and we need to plug a lot of the holes and the gaps through which has been exploited by Pakistan-based terrorists. So, but one thing is sure, India has 180 million Muslims, and there are only 6 million of those who are from Kashmir. So the claim that somehow Muslims are oppressed in India and facing human rights abuses and are living under some kind of colonial rule, that has been exploited to the hilt by the Pakistani intelligence agencies and their proxies, like this Jaish-e-Mohammed, for example, or Lashkar-e-Taiba. These are proscribed organizations, but, end of the day, they operate right under the noses of the security forces with impunity. And they raise funds, they have public rallies, they have what Jessica Stern, the academic from the US, once called a jihad culture. And that has been exported to the Kashmir Valley, which we control. So Indian Kashmir also, we have a lot of youth who are subject to this propaganda and to this hatred and incitement against India. And that's how they are being exploited to be used for violence against our forces and our civilians. So we have to look at the brainwashing and the indoctrination, the Salafist and the jihadist ideology that Pakistan is sponsoring. I think that is much bigger. And you look at the top heads of these organizations, they are living under the military and intelligence apparatus's protection. So my own view is that this problem cannot be solved as long as the military controls Pakistan and its destiny. We would want a kind of a democratic evolution there. Prime Minister Modi stretched his hand for friendship with Nawaz Sharif, When he was Prime Minister in 2015, he went to Lahore. We tried it out. We extended the hand of friendship, but it was a backstabbing all along. So I think there's a deep sense of betrayal, frustration. People don't want to engage diplomatically.
Okay.
So with due respect to our friends, our co-panelists, I will say that restraint is not an option if you're a victim. If you're being hit repeatedly and we don't want to be seen to be, a banana republic that can be played around, restraint is not a solution.
Okay.
We have to establish deterrence through all means. And I think that is the consensus view here.
And a deterrent is exactly what Prime Minister Modi is talking about. Imtiaz Gul, he's talking about swift and strong action against Pakistan. What do you expect the Indian Prime Minister to do, to enact?
Well, I think a lot of people within India are talking about the failures of the Modi government and for the failure of the Modi government's Kashmir policies, in fact, and that he withdrew the hand of friendship or hand of dialogue from Pakistan. Pakistan has been trying its best, reaching out as much as possible to engage India, and this is what voices from within India are also saying, that India is paying a very heavy price for Modi's bad Kashmir policies. A lot of former intelligence people like P. Bhadra Kumar has also talked about the abysmal failure of the Indian intelligence, but he also talks about this new generation of militants who have grown with violence under the Indian oppression the last 16, 17 years. And the real problem lies in the disconnect that currently exists between New Delhi and Kashmir. So what Modi and his colleagues need to do is to reach out not only to the disgruntled Kashmiri youth, but also to Pakistan. If they think Pakistan is such a key to getting a solution for Kashmir, then I think better sense would demand that Modi reaches out to Pakistan for finding a solution.
Okay.
It simply cannot happen in an air which is vitiated by a string of allegations holding every Pakistan responsible for everything.
OK, well, let's just bring in Victoria here. I mean, obviously, it's a very heated scenario, no matter who you speak to, Victoria, whether it's in India or in Pakistan. You're hearing what our guests are saying. I mean, in terms of trying to find a solution and also trying to find restraint, how difficult is that for politicians on both sides at the moment? Because we always know there's always backroom diplomacy that goes on between any two nations, and one has to assume there must be some form of backroom diplomacy that goes on between India and Pakistan.
Well, there has been backroom diplomacy over the decades, and I think what one has to do in this current scenario is go back a little bit to the history and see what's happened before. As you mentioned, I've written on Kashmir. I wrote my first book, which was published in 1996. That's nearly 23 years ago. And I'm afraid this is a repetition, different players, different prime ministers, different actors, but of what's happened in the past. And this is where I do think both governments have to actually take a step back and take stock. And until they do something more than the tit-for-tat, the blame game, this is going to happen again and again. And one always keeps saying, well, the next time it happens, we must make sure it doesn't happen again. But this is a rerun of what has happened in the past. And I feel we are losing sight of what the actual issue is. The issue stemmed, as we know, from 1947 and partition. But if you look at the state, we talk about Kashmir as though it's a monolithic whole. It isn't a monolithic whole. We're talking about people who live in the valley of Kashmir. But the Kashmir state, Jammu and Kashmir, is made up of Jammu, Ladakh, Gilgit-Baltistan, on the Pakistan-administered side, and this narrow strip of land that the Pakistanis call Azad, Jammu and Kashmir. And they're all people there who have different aspirations. And certainly these terrorist attacks don't help with a resolution, and they certainly don't help the people living in the valley.
Of course. Let's go to Sriram Cholia. If there are politicians in India watching this programme, or certainly I'm sure they're on many domestic channels talking about how to resolve this, is it now time to try and talk, or should I say, is it now time for New Delhi to try and talk in a constructive manner to politicians, civil society, policymakers within Indian-administered Kashmir to try and find out what they can do? Because there seems to be an impasse really on the domestic front in India, does there not? where if the community in the region there doesn't get what it wants at the moment and isn't happy with the way they're being treated, there are demonstrations on the streets. We've seen gunfire affecting families, children, the community at large. When will be the right time to talk?
I think it's got to have a significant spell of no terrorism and confidence-building measures before we can even talk about dialogue with Pakistan.
No, I'm not talking about Pakistan, Mr. Choliya. I'm not talking about Pakistan. I'm talking no, Mr. Choliya. I'm not talking about Pakistan. I'm talking about the Indian government in New Delhi speaking to civil society in Indian-administered Kashmir. They have Mr. Modi's government has done very little talking. He's opened railway lines. He's opened hospitals. He needs to start talking to the people, doesn't he?
No, but Sohail, no, let me get in, please. See, a lot of these civil society you talk about in the Kashmir Valley are themselves separatists. And they
but
want
they are Indian nationals. They are Indian nationals. They are Indian nationals. They are Indian nationals, Mr. Choliya.
We have been talking.
They are Indian passport holders. They have a right. They are Indian passport holders.
And who do not resort to terror.
They are Indian passport holders that have the right to speak to their government.
Sohail, the one who carried out the suicide bombing was also an Indian national. The one who carried out a suicide bombing was also an Indian national. Do you want us to talk to such people? We talk to those who have resorted to non-violence and who are willing to work within the confines of the Indian constitution. And that's the most important point. We have always said, and Prime Minister Modi has maintained it, his predecessors have always said, we are willing to have an internal settlement as long as you drop the secession claim. Because as far as India is concerned, we will not do dialogue with our internal citizens in Kashmir or with Pakistan as long as this claim for revisionism is there. You know, if we are okay with the status quo, if you want to reclaim part of the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, that's what we are looking at. I don't think India right now or at any time in the past is willing to concede a single inch of territory or make any compromise on this. So I think within that, once Pakistan drops the claim, once the civil society in Kashmir you're talking about are willing to work within the confines of the Indian constitution and India's territorial integrity and live with it. You know, most secessionist movements have died out through settlements for internal autonomy. And we are willing to grant those things as long as Pakistan stays away and as long as the civil society does not go hand in glove in a kind of a soft separatism, which is a kind of creating the justification, the ideological justification for terrorism.
I don't want to interrupt you. I know I'm having to because we've come to the end of the programme, but I do want to go back to Victoria in London because, Victoria, I know you want to get in and comment on what Mr. Choliya said, but we are heading towards an Indian general election. And what's happened here could very well play out on a much more larger national scale. I was wondering how you think this is going to play out. And of course,
yes, I
with
think
what you've just...
this is the problem. I think this is the problem that it's going to, obviously for a domestic community, the Indian government is going to play this issue as a sort of a way to garner support. If Modi looks soft on Pakistan, this is not going to win him many election votes. But what I do want to say, which is very important not to lose sight of, is that the Indian government's policy towards the Kashmiris has been to win hearts and minds. And unfortunately, this is what they were talking about 25 years ago. But unfortunately, they have managed to do the exact reverse. And especially since I've been traveling there, the alienation in the valley is back up again. And I think this is where the Indian government has to really look to itself and say, why is this alienation? Obviously, when you have a high military presence, you're going to have human rights abuses. And it's this cycle of human rights abuses, alienation, that the government has to get out of in order to have this dialogue to win hearts and minds. And it's going to be extremely difficult in this election period.
Ideological ground for justifying terrorism is totally unacceptable. There is no moral equivalence between the two countries, and frankly,
no one is
blaming both sides
terrorism.
Is, you know,
absolutely.
the international community has given up this whole thing.
It seems,
you are simply
ladies and
creating
gentlemen,
a moral
Victoria,
restraint on both sides. For what? Who needs to be restrained? In this case, the rogue state, the sponsor of terrorism, needs to be restrained.
OK, Mr. Choliya, I think that obviously we can see that this particular subject on either side of the border and even independently is always a hot topic every time we discuss it. And it's a very difficult, certainly, scenario that both India and Pakistan are facing right now. We will end Inside Story there, but I'd like to thank my guests, Sriram Choliya, Victoria Schofield and Imtiaz Gul for a very enlightening conversation. Thanks for joining us here in the studio. And I'd like to thank you as well for watching this edition of Inside Story. Now, you can watch the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sahil Rahman, and the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.